So many of you have asked me more about the DNA, what could be happening behind the scenes with the DNA testing. Remember, there was DNA found inside Nancy's home that investigators said did not belong to Nancy or anyone in her family or her inner circle, which was a good thing. I mean, it could belong to the suspect. The problem is, as you know if you've been following the case, the DNA is mixed.
The sheriff's office also finding a pair of black gloves in the area close to Guthrie's home.
Investigators have confirmed that a new DNA analysis system was brought in specifically for the Nancy Guthrie case. The specific platform has not been publicly identified, but based on what is publicly known about the current state of forensic DNA technology and the specific challenges presented by the mixed sample in this case, I want to walk you through what that technology is most likely doing. Traditional DNA analysis methods for mixed samples rely on capillary electrophoresis. This is the standard laboratory process that has been used in forensic labs for decades. It works well for single-source samples. It becomes significantly more complicated when the sample contains contributions from multiple people, because the signals from different contributors overlap and create ambiguity in the profile. Newer technologies, particularly those based on massively parallel sequencing, take a completely different approach. Instead of analyzing the DNA at a relatively small number of genetic markers, these systems sequence a vastly larger portion of the genome. When you have more data points from each contributor, the statistical process of separating individual profiles from a mixed sample becomes dramatically more accurate. You can identify which genetic signals belong together because you have enough information to see the pattern across a wide enough section of the genetic code. The practical result is this: a mixed DNA sample that a traditional forensic lab could not cleanly separate into individual profiles, a sample that would generate an inconclusive or ambiguous result using capillary electrophoresis, can potentially yield clear, submission-ready individual profiles using massively parallel sequencing. The evidence that appears to be a wall with one technology becomes a door with another. If the FBI has brought in a massively parallel sequencing platform for the Nancy Guthrie case, and the reporting strongly suggests that something in that category is what they are using, then the mixed DNA sample from inside the home is not dead evidence. It is evidence that is waiting for the right tool, and the right tool appears to have arrived. Touch DNA, what the gloves tell us beyond the profile. I want to talk about something that is specific to glove DNA evidence and that I have not seen discussed clearly in any other coverage of this case. Because the type of DNA collected from gloves is important, and understanding it helps you understand what else those gloves might be able to tell investigators beyond just a genetic profile. DNA from gloves is collected through a process called touch DNA analysis. Touch DNA refers to genetic material left behind through physical contact. When your skin touches a surface, cells transfer from your fingertips and palms to that surface. Those cells contain your DNA. The amount transferred is typically very small, measured in nanograms, fractions of a gram. But modern forensic methods can extract a usable profile from remarkably small biological deposits. In the case of those gloves, the wearer's skin cells would have transferred through the interior of the gloves during the time they were worn. Even with gloves on, your skin sheds cells continuously. The interior surface of a glove worn for any sustained period will carry a significant concentration of the wearer's touch DNA. And those cells are typically well preserved because they are protected from environmental exposure by the glove material itself. But touch DNA analysis can tell investigators more than just the genetic profile of the person who wore the gloves. It can tell them about wear time. How long were the gloves on? The concentration and distribution of cellular material inside a glove correlates with the amount of time it was worn. This is not precise enough to give investigators a specific number, but it can distinguish between gloves worn for a few minutes versus gloves worn for an hour or more. It can also tell investigators something about the physical exertion of the person who wore them. More intense physical activity means more skin cell transfer, more moisture, more biological material deposited in specific areas of the glove. The pattern of biological deposition inside a glove in the right forensic analysis can provide information about the physical demands placed on the wearer's hands during the time the gloves were worn. And there is something else. Touch DNA analysis can sometimes detect not just the wearer's DNA, but secondary transfer DNA from surfaces they touched while wearing the gloves. A person who touched specific materials, opened specific surfaces, or handled specific objects while wearing those gloves may have transferred trace amounts of other biological material onto the exterior of the gloves. That secondary material, if it exists and if it can be identified, is an additional forensic thread. The FBI's forensic laboratory is not just analyzing those gloves for a profile to run through a database. They are extracting everything those gloves recorded about the person who wore them. Every biological trace, every contact signature, every piece of information that science can extract from the material that was deposited there during 41 minutes in the dark outside an 84-year-old woman's home. The databases, GEDmatch, and what investigators can access now. I need to talk about the databases, because forensic genetic genealogy only works if the unknown DNA profile can be compared against a database that contains profiles of the suspect's relatives. And the landscape of who controls those databases, and under what conditions law enforcement can access them, is one of the most significant practical questions in this entire investigation. The two primary consumer genetic databases that have historically been used in forensic genetic genealogy investigations are GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. GEDmatch is a platform where people who have taken consumer DNA tests through services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe can upload their raw genetic data for genealogical research purposes. For several years, GEDmatch had an opt-in policy for law enforcement access. Users could choose whether to allow their profile to be compared against crime scene DNA submitted by investigators. In 2020, GEDmatch changed its policy to opt-in by default, meaning law enforcement can only access profiles of users who have specifically chosen to allow that access. This significantly reduced the size of the searchable pool for criminal investigations. Family Tree DNA has a different arrangement, having worked directly with the FBI on certain investigation categories under specific protocols. The challenge in the Nancy Guthrie case, as CeCe Moore has noted in her broader public statements about forensic genealogy, is that the size and composition of the accessible database affects how likely it is that the unknown profile will find relative matches close enough to trace. If the person who wore those gloves has no relatives who have uploaded their DNA to an accessible database, the genealogy search may find only very distant matches, making the family tree tracing process far more time-consuming and potentially inconclusive. But here is what the data on genetic genealogy database coverage actually shows. As of the most recent publicly available estimates, GEDmatch contains profiles from approximately 1 million users, and Family Tree DNA contains profiles from several million users. Consumer DNA testing has been enormously popular in the United States. Tens of millions of Americans have taken Ancestry DNA or 23andMe tests. Many of those profiles are in searchable databases. The statistical reality is that in a country where this many people have tested, the probability that any given individual has at least one relative who has uploaded their DNA to one of these platforms is high. Researchers have estimated that a database of approximately 3 million profiles provides approximately 90% coverage of the population of European American ancestry when searching at the third cousin level. 3 million profiles is a threshold that accessible genetic genealogy databases have likely crossed. This means that for the majority of individuals in the United States, their DNA, even if they have never tested themselves, never been arrested, never interacted with any law enforcement database, can potentially be connected to their identity through the DNA of a relative who chose to explore their family history through a consumer test. The person who wore those gloves cannot know whether their cousin, their parent, their sibling, their aunt or uncle chose to take a DNA test and upload it to GEDmatch. They cannot know whether that relative's profile is currently accessible to law enforcement. They cannot know whether that relative's family tree has already been mapped by a genetic genealogist working quietly from an FBI forensic laboratory in Quantico. That uncertainty is the most powerful thing about forensic genetic genealogy as a tool. The suspect cannot assess their own exposure. They cannot know what the science can find. And that asymmetry between what investigators can learn and what the suspect knows about what investigators can learn is exactly the kind of asymmetry that eventually produces breaks in cases. The procurement trail: how the DNA connects to a larger picture. Brian Entin has been consistent about something throughout his coverage of this case that I want to connect to the DNA evidence specifically. He has said he does not believe this crime was committed by a stranger. He believes the person responsible is connected to Nancy's world. He believes this was planned. He has said that familiarity changes everything, and that a stranger guesses while a planner knows. Now think about what that assessment means in the context of a DNA profile from gloves worn outside Nancy's home. If this was planned, then the gloves were acquired deliberately. The planning for this operation included acquiring specific equipment: a mask, a backpack, gloves. And based on everything the pacemaker data and the crime scene evidence suggest about how this abduction unfolded, possibly a sedating compound. All of those items were acquired before the night of February 1st. All of those acquisitions are potential evidence trails. The gloves themselves may be traceable. A specific type of glove purchased at a specific store using a specific payment method creates a record. Retail surveillance footage at the point of purchase creates a record. Digital transactions create a record. If the gloves were purchased in person with cash, that is harder to trace but not impossible. If they were purchased online or with any trackable payment method, investigators have a direct procurement trail connecting a buyer to the specific evidence found at the scene. The FBI knows this. Investigators working a case like this do not just analyze the evidence itself. They try to trace the evidence backward to its origin. Where did this come from? Who bought it? When? The answer to those questions, combined with the DNA profile from the same gloves, creates a convergence of evidence that is far stronger than either piece alone. And there is a personal note I want to add here, because this is my read of where this investigation is heading, and I think it is worth saying clearly. The person who planned this crime, according to every forensic and behavioral indicator in this case, is not a first-time criminal acting on impulse. This was organized. This was deliberate. This was prepared. People who commit crimes at this level of organization often make one consistent mistake. They underestimate how much the objects they use remember. The gloves remember who wore them. The crime scene remembers who was there. And modern forensic science has never been better at reading that memory. What the DNA will prove in court, the prosecution angle. Let me shift perspective for a moment and talk about what all of this DNA evidence, once an identification is made, means from a prosecution standpoint. Because evidence collected today is being preserved not just for investigative purposes, but for eventual use in a federal courtroom. And understanding the evidentiary power of this material helps you understand why the FBI has been so methodical and so silent about their findings. The glove DNA, once identified, establishes that a specific person's hands were inside those gloves. It does not prove beyond all doubt that the person with that DNA profile committed the abduction. Defense attorneys will argue alternative explanations: secondary transfer, contamination, alternative sources of DNA on the gloves. These are the standard arguments raised against touch DNA evidence in criminal proceedings. But here is what makes the DNA in this case particularly powerful. The gloves were found near the scene. The gloves matched the camera footage of the suspect. The suspect on that footage was captured in the act of disabling the surveillance camera at Nancy's home while carrying a firearm and a backpack. The camera footage places a specific person with those specific gloves at that specific location at that specific time. The DNA identifies who wore those gloves. The combination of the footage and the DNA creates an evidentiary convergence that is extremely difficult to attack at trial. Defense attorneys can challenge touch DNA. They cannot easily challenge touch DNA plus video footage, plus location evidence, plus timeline correlation. Each piece of evidence independently carries weight. Combined, they carry the weight of a case. The mixed DNA from inside the home, if it can be separated into clean profiles, adds another layer. If the interior crime scene DNA matches the same profile as the glove DNA, you now have biological evidence of that person both outside and inside the property. That eliminates the secondary transfer argument. A person whose DNA is inside the home they were not supposed to enter was inside that home. Full stop. Federal prosecutors in the District of Arizona are building a case. They are doing it carefully, methodically, and quietly. The DNA evidence is the foundation that everything else will be measured against when a name is eventually confirmed. And when that confirmation comes, the prosecution will have a forensic record built over months of the most technically sophisticated analysis the United States government can deploy.
Why the FBI is silent, and what that silence actually means. I want to address something directly because I hear frustration in the comments from viewers who want to know why, after more than 10 weeks, the FBI has not publicly shared what they know about the DNA evidence. Why no press conference laying out the forensic findings? Why no confirmation of whether the genealogy search has found anything? The answer is simple. Every detail that law enforcement shares publicly about their evidence and their findings is information that the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance also receives. Every statement about the DNA processing, every disclosure about what databases are being searched, every confirmation that the genealogy process has found family matches. All of that information tells the suspect exactly how close investigators are, and exactly how much time they might have to run. In an active investigation where the victim may still be alive, that consideration is not abstract, it is urgent. If the FBI announced publicly that the genealogy search had narrowed the field to a specific family cluster, the person responsible would know. They would know how close the identification is. They would know how much time they have before law enforcement arrives at their door. And in a situation where Nancy Guthrie's location and survival depend on what that person decides to do next, giving them that information could be catastrophic. The FBI's silence about the DNA findings is strategic. It is the silence of investigators who have something significant and are protecting it carefully until the moment it can be used. It is not the silence of investigators who found nothing. Nothing does not require this level of protection. Brian Entin, reporting on the investigation's overall status, described the case as far from cold. He described sources inside the investigation as frustrated with the pace of progress, not because there is no evidence, but because there is evidence that has not yet been fully converted into an identifiable name. That distinction matters. Frustrated because progress is slow is not the same as frustrated because there is nothing to work with. The evidence is there. The science is working on it. The silence is protecting it. The comparison: Golden State Killer and what came next. In April of 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in his driveway in Sacramento, California. He was 72 years old. He had been free for more than 30 years since his last known crimes. He had lived a quiet life. He had worked as a grocery store manager. He had grandchildren. The neighborhood knew him as a regular person. He was also one of the most prolific serial criminals in American history. 12 confirmed murders, at least 50 sexual assaults, 100 or more burglaries. Crimes that terrorized communities across California from the mid-1970s into the 1980s. Decades of investigation had produced nothing. Traditional forensics had his DNA. CODIS had nothing to match it to. Cold case detectives had worked on it for years. Then, forensic genetic genealogy was applied to his DNA. His distant relatives, who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic data to GED Match to trace their ancestry, became the starting point. Family trees were built. A list of possible contributors was generated. A discarded paper cup from outside DeAngelo's home provided the confirmation sample. And a man who had believed for 30 years that science would never find him was handcuffed in front of his own house. The science that found him is the same science being applied right now to the DNA from the gloves found near Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson, Arizona. I am not saying the outcome of this case will mirror the Golden State Killer case in timeline or circumstances. Every investigation is different. Every DNA search is different. The genealogy results depend on what relative matches the databases return and how traceable those family trees are. There are no guarantees in forensic genealogy. There are only probabilities. And the probability that this DNA profile remains permanently unidentifiable, given the scale of consumer genetic testing in the United States today, is lower than at any point in the history of criminal investigation. The person who wore those gloves on the night of February 1st does not know what their relatives have uploaded to which databases. They cannot know. And that unknowing is what keeps the science working, even when the suspect believes they are safe. What comes next, when the breakthrough arrives? Let me give you my honest assessment of where this investigation is and what the DNA breakthrough, when it comes, will look like. Because I think it is important to be clear about expectations. Forensic genetic genealogy is not fast. The Golden State Killer investigation took over a year from the initial genealogy search to the arrest. Other cases have taken months. The process is methodical. It depends on the quality of the database matches returned, the completeness of the family trees that genealogists can build from those matches, and the availability and cooperation of individuals on the narrowed list for comparison testing. In the Nancy Guthrie case, investigators are managing multiple DNA evidence streams simultaneously. The glove profile, the mixed crime scene sample, which is being processed through new technology, any additional biological material collected during the multiple searches of properties connected to this case. All of these streams are being processed in parallel, and each one represents a potential independent path to the same identification. The breakthrough will not be announced in stages. It will not be previewed. Brian Entin and other reporters covering this case will not get a heads up that identification is imminent and arrests are being prepared. Federal criminal investigations do not work that way. The FBI will build its case, confirm its identification, obtain its warrants, and move. And when they move, the announcement will come quickly, publicly, and completely. Until that moment, the silence continues. The science continues. And the DNA inside those gloves continues to do what DNA does. It sits there, unchanging, patient, waiting for the process to finish. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker. She needs medical care. She has a family that has been living in a specific kind of agony for more than 10 weeks. The urgency of this investigation is not abstract. It is medical. It is human. It is the difference between a family that gets answers and a family that gets questions that never end. The evidence room has not been emptied. The science has not stopped. Brian Entin has not walked away. And neither have we. Closing. Nancy Guthrie's DNA is a witness. There's something I want to leave you with. Something that I think captures what makes the DNA evidence in this case different from most of what people typically hear about in criminal investigations. The DNA on those gloves is not just a tool for identifying the person who wore them. It is a physical record of presence. It is biological proof that a specific human being stood outside an 84-year-old woman's home in the early hours of the morning and made a choice. Every cell that shed from their skin into the interior of those gloves was deposited at the moment of that choice. Every touch DNA transfer was a biological signature of a decision. And that signature, sealed in the fabric of a discarded pair of gloves, has been in FBI custody since February 15th. Science does not have a conscience. It does not care about motive, or planning, or the care someone took to cover their tracks. It reads what is there and reports what it finds. And what it finds in those gloves is going to find a name. Brian Entin said he believes this case is going to be solved. C.C. Moore said the science to solve it exists. 100 investigators are actively working it. A $1.1 million reward is still on the table. New DNA technology has been brought in specifically for this case. And the person responsible left a biological record of themselves at the scene that the most powerful forensic science in the world is currently processing. This case is moving. Quietly, methodically, precisely, in the direction of a name. If you have any information about this case, call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-2255-324. You can submit anonymously at tips.fbi.gov. The reward is real. The investigation is active. And information that leads to Nancy's recovery changes everything. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which part of the DNA science surprised you most? And if you have not watched our previous breakdown of the full timeline of evidence in this case, that video is linked right here. Watch it next. Subscribe to the Evidence Room and turn on notifications, because when this case breaks, you will want to be here first.
There is a pair of gloves sitting inside an FBI evidence facility right now. They are sealed in a forensic container. They have a case number on the label. They have been photographed, cataloged, swabbed, and analyzed by some of the most advanced biological science the United States government has access to. And inside those gloves, on the surface of the fabric, where fingers pressed and gripped and moved through the dark outside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared, there is a DNA profile. A male DNA profile. A profile that does not match any member of Nancy Guthrie's family. A profile that the FBI has been running through every database available to them since the second week of February. And what that profile contains, what it can reveal, what it is capable of exposing about the person who wore those gloves on the night an 84-year-old woman was taken from her home in Tucson, Arizona, is what this video is about. Because most people have heard the headline, gloves found, DNA recovered, no match yet. And most people heard that and moved on. They treated it like a dead end, like evidence that was found but could not be used, like science that ran up against a wall. That is not what is happening. Not even close. What is actually happening inside the FBI's forensic laboratories right now is something that most mainstream coverage has not taken the time to explain. It is a science that is quiet, methodical, and extraordinarily powerful. It is a science that has solved cases that sat cold for 30 years. It is a science that identified a serial killer who terrorized California for a decade and walked free for decades more. And it is the same science that is right now, at this moment, being applied to the DNA recovered from those gloves found near Nancy Guthrie's home. Brian Entin, the News Nation correspondent who has been on the ground in Tucson covering this case from day one, has been reporting on the DNA evidence as one of the central threads of this entire investigation. He brought in one of the most respected forensic genetic genealogists in the country, C.C. Moore, to discuss what this DNA evidence means and where it can lead. And what she said on that broadcast should have been the headline of every major news outlet covering this case. Because she did not say this evidence is a dead end. She said this evidence is a pathway. She said the science exists to follow it. And she said the question is not whether it can be done. The question is whether investigators are being given the tools and the access they need to do it. Today, on the Evidence Room, we are going deeper into that science than any other channel has gone. We are going to break down exactly what forensic genetic genealogy is, how it works, what the FBI can do with an unknown male DNA profile, what the mixed DNA sample from inside Nancy's home means for the investigation, what new technology has been brought in specifically for this case, and what the DNA breakthrough that is coming will actually look like when it arrives.
Stay with me through the entire video, because by the time we get to the end, you are going to understand why the person who wore those gloves that night may have made a decision that they cannot undo. They left something behind, something biological, something that does not forget, something that, in the right hands, with the right science, can find them no matter how carefully they think they disappeared. If you are new to the evidence room, welcome. This channel exists to go deeper than the headlines, to understand the science behind the evidence, and to ask the questions that deserve an answer. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this case is moving and you need to be here when it breaks. What Brian Entin said and why it matters. Before we go into the science itself, I want to establish something important, because some of what I am going to explain today goes beyond what has been officially confirmed in public statements from the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Office. And I want you to understand why I am confident in the direction this evidence is pointing. Brian Entin has covered more major missing persons and abduction cases than almost any other journalist currently working in American television news. He was on the ground for the Gabby Petito investigation. He has covered cases involving forensic genetic genealogy before. And when he brought C.C. Moore onto his broadcast to discuss the Nancy Guthrie DNA evidence, he was not doing it for drama. He was doing it because he understands what this evidence is capable of, and he wanted his audience to understand it too. What Entin has been saying consistently throughout his coverage of this case is something I want you to hold in your mind as we go through everything today. He has said, repeatedly, that he does not believe this was a random crime. He has said the person responsible is not far from Nancy's world. He has said the evidence is pointing somewhere specific. And in his most recent reporting, he has made clear that the DNA evidence, both from the gloves and from inside the home, is one of the primary active threads the FBI is pursuing. Entin also reported something that most people glossed over in the day-to-day coverage. Investigators collected DNA from individuals connected to the case. Those individuals were subsequently released. Now, officially, Tomasso, Annie Guthrie's husband and the last known person to see Nancy alive, has been ruled out as a suspect by law enforcement. I am not going to contradict that. That is the official position, and I report it accurately. But what the DNA collection and testing process tells us is significant regardless of the outcome. The FBI did not just take the glove DNA and run it through a database and stop. They built a comparison framework. They collected DNA from people in Nancy's immediate circle, tested those profiles against the crime scene evidence, and used those comparisons to systematically eliminate individuals from consideration. That process of elimination is not a dead end. It is a narrowing. Every person you rule out brings you closer to the person you cannot rule out. And that person's DNA is still in those gloves. Still waiting. Still science. What most people got wrong about the DNA evidence. Let me correct something before we go any further, because the way the DNA evidence in this case has been reported in most mainstream coverage has created a misunderstanding that is important to fix. The narrative that emerged early in this investigation was simple. Gloves were found, DNA was recovered. It does not match anyone in the system. Therefore, the DNA is a dead end until the suspect is already identified through other means. That narrative is incomplete, and understanding why it is incomplete is the foundation for understanding everything else I am about to explain. When investigators say a DNA profile does not match anyone in the system, they are specifically saying it did not return a direct hit in CODIS. CODIS stands for the Combined DNA Index System. It is the FBI's national DNA database, which contains profiles collected from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scene evidence from across the country. A direct CODIS hit means the unknown profile exactly matches a profile already in the database. It means law enforcement has a name. But no CODIS hit does not mean the DNA is useless. It does not mean the science stops.
It does not mean investigators fold their hands and wait. In 2026, a DNA profile without a CODIS hit is the beginning of a process, not the end of one. And that process, the one that investigators are currently running on the DNA from those gloves, is called forensic genetic genealogy. And it is the most powerful development in criminal investigation science in the last 20 years. The gloves. What was actually found and why it is so significant? On or around February 15th, the FBI announced that gloves had been found near Nancy Guthrie's home. Those gloves matched the gloves visible on the masked figure in the doorbell camera footage from the night Nancy disappeared. The FBI confirmed that DNA recovered from those gloves belonged to an unidentified male and did not match any family members. Now I want to walk through the forensic significance of this finding carefully, because every word in that announcement matters. First, the gloves match the camera footage. That is a physical connection between the DNA evidence and the known suspect in this case. This is not ambient DNA picked up from a neighborhood mailbox. This is DNA from the hands of a specific person who was documented on video outside Nancy's home in the early hours of February 1st, carrying a backpack and a firearm and disabling her doorbell camera. The DNA and the footage are connected. That connection is significant because it means whoever left that DNA is the person on that footage, not someone who might be connected, not a secondary contact, the person. Second, the DNA belongs to an unidentified male. The word unidentified is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I want to unpack it. Unidentified means the profile did not return a hit in CODIS. It does not mean the profile is weak. It does not mean the sample was degraded. A clear, strong, identified sex DNA profile from physical evidence directly connected to the crime scene is extraordinarily valuable forensic evidence. The identification part is what investigators are now working on, and they have science to do it.
Third, it does not match any family members.
This is the comparison framework I mentioned earlier. The FBI collected DNA from people in Nancy's immediate network, tested them, and confirmed they do not match the crime scene profile. That means the person who wore those gloves and approached Nancy's home that night is someone outside the immediate family DNA pool. Someone whose profile has to be found through a different approach. That different approach is what we are about to discuss, the mixed DNA problem. What is happening inside Nancy's home? Before we get into the genealogy science, I need to walk you through the second DNA thread in this investigation. Because the gloves are one piece, the crime scene is another, and the two pieces present very different forensic challenges. Investigators recovered a mixed DNA sample from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. A mixed sample means the biological material collected at the scene contained genetic contributions from more than one person. The sample could not immediately be separated into clean individual profiles. Mixed DNA samples are among the most technically challenging evidence that forensic scientists work with. When you have a single source DNA sample, the analysis is relatively straightforward. You extract the genetic material, you amplify it, you run it through the analysis process, and you compare the profile to known samples or databases. When you have a mixed sample, you have overlapping genetic signals. You have multiple contributors whose DNA is intertwined in the same material. Separating those profiles requires advanced statistical modeling, specialized software, and in many cases, a level of technical expertise that goes well beyond a standard forensic lab. CeCe Moore, speaking on Brian Entin's broadcast, specifically highlighted this challenge. She noted that the mixed DNA from inside the home is presenting difficulties for investigators trying to isolate a clean profile that can be used for comparison or database submission. And she said something that I thought was one of the most practically significant statements made about this case in weeks. She said investigators should go back to the crime scene.
Because in situations where an initial sample is too mixed or too degraded to produce a usable profile, a second collection from the same location sometimes yields a cleaner sample. A different swab from a slightly different location. A sample that had less contact contamination. A biological deposit that was not in the same concentrated spot as the mixed material. This is not an admission that the investigation is failing. It is the opposite. It is a forensic expert saying the tools are available and the evidence is probably still there. The fact that the FBI has reportedly brought in a new DNA analysis machine specifically for this case tells you that investigators are not treating the mixed sample as a closed chapter. They are applying newer, more powerful technology to extract a usable profile from material that older methods struggled with. And if that new technology succeeds, if the mixed sample yields a clean profile that can be submitted to a genealogy database, then investigators will have two separate DNA profiles pointing toward whoever entered that home on the night of February 1st. The glove profile and the crime scene profile. If those two profiles match each other, the identification of that individual becomes the only remaining step. How forensic genetic genealogy actually works. The science the FBI is using now. I want to spend real time on the science, because this is the part of the video where I am going to explain something that most crime coverage glosses over in a single sentence. And understanding this science is understanding exactly why the person who left their DNA on those gloves cannot simply wait and hope. Forensic genetic genealogy is not the same thing as running a profile through CODIS. They are completely different processes with completely different outcomes. CODIS works by comparing short tandem repeat markers, which are specific sequences in the DNA that vary between individuals. The database stores profiles built from those markers. When you submit an unknown profile, the system looks for an exact match to a known profile already stored. No exact match means no result. It is binary, match or no match. Forensic genetic genealogy works on an entirely different genetic layer. Instead of looking at short tandem repeat markers, genetic genealogy uses single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are single letter variations at specific positions in the DNA sequence that are shared among relatives because they are inherited together across generations. They are not unique to individuals. They are shared across family lines. And that sharing is exactly what makes them useful for identifying someone who is not in any criminal database. Here is how the process works in practice. The FBI's forensic laboratory extracts DNA from the gloves. They use a specialized sequencing process to generate what is called a SNP profile from that DNA. This SNP profile, unlike a CODIS profile, is designed not to find an exact match, but to find relatives. It is submitted to one or more genetic genealogy databases, which include profiles voluntarily uploaded by millions of people who used consumer DNA testing services to trace their ancestry. When the unknown profile is compared to the database, the system identifies partial matches, not exact matches, partial matches. People who share enough genetic material with the unknown contributor to be estimated relatives. A first cousin match, a second cousin match, a distant relative at the third or fourth cousin level. Those partial matches are the starting point. A skilled genetic genealogist, like Cece Moore herself, then takes those partial matches and builds family trees. They research public records, genealogical databases, obituaries, census records, historical documents. They map out the branches of the family trees connected to the partial matches, and they work methodically inward, narrowing the field of possible contributors to the unknown DNA until they arrive at a small group of individuals who could be the source of that profile. At that point, investigators collect a comparison sample, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through a court order, from individuals on that narrowed list. When the comparison sample matches the crime scene profile, the identity is confirmed. This is exactly how the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018. Joseph James DeAngelo had no DNA in CODIS. He had no criminal record that generated a DNA profile. He had been free for decades. But when investigators submitted his unknown DNA profile to GED Match, they found distant relatives whose family trees, when built out,
ultimately pointed to him. A discarded sample confirmed the match. And one of the most prolific serial criminals in American history was arrested in his driveway. The same science, the same databases, the same process, right now, being applied to the DNA from those gloves found near Nancy Guthrie's home. Cece Moore, who she is and what she said about this case. If you are not familiar with Cece Moore, you need to be. She is not a television personality who happens to know some facts about DNA. She is arguably the most accomplished forensic genetic genealogist working in the field today. She pioneered the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations in the United States. She worked on the Golden State Killer case. She has helped solve hundreds of violent crimes through her work with the DNA Doe Project and with Parabon Nanolabs. When Brian Entin brought her onto his broadcast to discuss the Nancy Guthrie case, it was not a casual expert appearance. Cece Moore does not do casual appearances on cases she does not believe have forensic significance. She spoke about this case because the DNA evidence in it is real, it is usable, and the science to follow it exists. What she said specifically about the glove DNA and the mixed crime scene sample is worth sitting with. She confirmed that the FBI is actively pursuing forensic genetic genealogy as an identification approach. She noted the challenge of the mixed sample and recommended returning to the scene for a cleaner collection. And she said something about the state of the science that I think is the most important piece of the entire conversation. She said the technology to identify this person from the DNA evidence exists today. She said it clearly, not as a hope or a possibility, but as a statement of current forensic reality. The tools are there. The databases are there. The expertise is there. The question, as she framed it, is access. Access to the right databases. Access to the investigative authorization to run the genealogy process. Access to the comparison samples needed to confirm a match once the genealogy narrows the field. And that is where this case sits right now, not at a dead end, at the beginning of a process that has never failed to produce a result when the evidence quality was sufficient and the access was available. The FBI has the evidence. They have the quality. The access question is what investigators and prosecutors are working through right now. The new DNA machine, what it can do that nothing before could. There is a piece of technology that has entered this investigation that most of the coverage has mentioned in passing without explaining what it actually does. And I think it is worth explaining because it changes the calculus around the mixed DNA sample.